We're on the lookout for sponsors to join us on our incredible journey with Inspired Change with Gunter. If your organisation cares deeply about meaningful conversations around masculinity, self-development and mental health, we'd love to partner with you. Our podcast has a wonderful, dedicated audience committed to personal growth and positive social change. By sponsoring Inspired Change with Gunter, your brand will connect with listeners who truly value thoughtful discussion and support initiatives that promote real transformation. We're incredibly proud to be ranked number 1 in Australia and number 5 in the USA on FeedSpot's top men's mental health podcasts. For more information on how to become a sponsor, please reach out to Miranda Spiegner Sapon, our showrunner and executive producer. We'd love to explore how we can work together to inspire change. Now, thank you for your continued support, and let's keep inspiring change together.
You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter Swoboda. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change with Gunter. There is a kind of question a person asks when they already suspect the answer, and that it'll break their heart. Not the brisk question that wants a fact handed back, but the slower one, asked quietly, that is a real way of staying in the room with something unbearable instead of turning away from it. When Marvin Gaye stood at a microphone in Detroit in the middle of 1970 and asked what was going on, he was asking that kind of question. He was not requesting information. He knew, more or less, what was happening in the cities and in the war. The question was doing something else, something psychological. And it is that something else that I want to sit with today. So the song that I'm talking about is What's Going On by Marvin Gaye, released in 1971. Now here's what draws me in. It's a protest song that usually tells you what to think. It names the villain, it sharpens the grievance, and it sends you out into the street with your jaw set. This song does almost none of that. It gathers rather than accuses. It asks questions that have no clear answer, and then it holds the asking open long enough for other people to climb inside it. So the question I want to put to us is this: what psychological work does it do to ask what's going on? Asking it out loud in front of everyone, when some part of you already knows that the answer is grief. So stay with me. The song didn't begin with Marvin Gaye. It began with a bus window and a beating. In May of 1969, Ronaldo Benson, known to everyone as Obi, one of the voices in the Four Tops, was traveling through Berkeley when he saw police moving hard against demonstrators on a contested patch of ground that people had started calling the People's Park. What he saw unsettled him, and he couldn't put it down. He carried the image home and began working it into a song with the Motown writer Al Cleveland. Now, Benson told the story many times in later years, and one thing he said matters for everything that follows. His own group turned the song down. They heard it as a protest, and Benson insisted it was nothing of the kind. In his account, it was a love story, a song about wanting to understand. He said more or less that he was not protesting, he simply wanted to know what was going on. So the song arrived at Marvin Gaye already carrying a small argument about its own nature. Was it protest or was it love? Gaye took it and made that very ambiguity the center of the whole thing. He had his own reasons to be ready for it. By the end of the 1960s, Gaye had grown restless inside a machine that had made him a star. Motown sold romance and polish, and Gaye had sold a great deal of both. Something in him had begun to strain against it. His younger brother Frankie had just come back from 3 years in Vietnam and had started to talk, and Gaye listened. The biographer David Ritz, who interviewed Gaye at length, records how deeply those conversations had reached him. Ritz also preserves the sentiment that has followed Gaye ever since. The sense of a man asking how he was supposed to go on singing love songs while the world outside was coming apart. Now, I want to be careful here. That is Gaye's reported reflection, gathered by a biographer. It's not a diagnosis and it's not a documentary script, but it tells us the direction he was facing. The recording itself has become part of the legend, and most of it is well documented. The basic track was laid down at Motown's Detroit studios on the 1st of June 1970. David Van der Pitt wrote the orchestral arrangement, and the strings were added later that year. Along the way, something happened that Gaye chose to keep. Two of his lead vocals, the takes ended up being layered over each other. And he decided, rather than to correct it, he liked the effect of a man seeming to answering himself, and he built on it. The record reaches you as a conversation Gaye is having with his own voice. And the sound itself argues for the same posture. The record opens not with a fanfare, but with a murmur of party, a saxophone drifting in, voices greeting one another, as though we've walked into a room already full of people. The arrangement is loose and jazz inflected, built on a bass line that strolls rather than marches. Nothing about it is braced for confrontation. The music is doing what the words are doing, inviting rather than commanding. And that agreement between what is said and how it sounds is a large part of why the song persuaded us without ever raising its voice. Getting it released was its own struggle. Berry Gordy, who ran Motown, didn't want it. By several accounts, he thought it was a mistake, too political for the label, and he said so bluntly. Gaye's response was to stop and refuse to record anything else until the song came out. It was released as a single in January 1971 on the Tamla label, and it climbed to number 2 on the national chart and sat at the top of the soul chart for 5 weeks. The album followed in May. Gaye became the first Motown artist to receive full production credit on his own record. The man who would not be told what to sing had turned out, commercially, to be right. Now let's take a look at the psychology here, because a hit is not the same thing as a piece of emotional machinery, and this song has both. Let's start with who's speaking. Across the album, the point of view returns again and again to a soldier coming home, a young man walking back into a country he no longer recognizes, met not with welcome, but with suspicion and hardship. That framing gives us a way in because there's a body of clinical work that speaks directly to what such a return does to a person. And I've worked with those people as well. And so I completely agree with this. The psychiatrist Jonathan Shea, working with Vietnam veterans, described what he called the undoing of character, the way that witnessing or taking part in acts that violate one's deepest moral sense can corrode a person's trust in the world itself. A little later, the clinical psychologist Brett Litz and his colleagues gave this its now standard name, moral injury. And it defined the lasting harm that follows perpetrating, failing to prevent, or bearing witness to acts that transgress one's own moral beliefs. Now, I want to keep the categories clean here. It is evidence that the album is voiced from a returning veteran's vantage point. That is the record and in the accounts of how it was made. It's my interpretation, not a claim about Marvin Gaye's inner life, that the song works so well because it captures the texture of moral injury from the inside. What the singer expresses is not only fear, which is where we usually locate the wound of war. It is something closer to bewilderment and a sorrow and a moral order that's failed. That is the signature of moral distress rather than simple fright. And it is why the song aches in the particular way it does. Against the project's 7 psychological functions of a song, 3 fit into one closely, and one, interestingly, doesn't. The first is recognition. The song gives language, or rather gives a question to an experience that many people are living without words for. To hear your own confusion sung back to you with tenderness is to feel less alone inside. The second is belonging. The record is full of other voices, background singers, overlapping lines, the sound of a room rather than a soloist. And it addresses the listener as kin. It uses the language of family and closeness, and it gathers the frightened and the grieving into a single circle. The third is reconciliation. The song does not seek victory over an enemy. That would be a disservice to what's been experienced. It seeks a way to hold suffering without being destroyed by it, and so keep the possibility of tenderness alive in the middle of catastrophe. The function it pointedly refuses is resistance. Most songs that address war and injustice work by restoring the listener's sense of agency, by turning helplessness into defiance. This one declines that route. It stays in the question psychologically. That is a bold and slightly risky move because it asks the listener to tolerate not knowing, to remain in what the poet Keats once called negative capability, the capacity to sit with uncertainty and doubt without reaching irritability after resolution. The song trusts us to stay there, and that trust is a large part of its dignity. There is something worth pausing on in how the record makes the listener feel personally addressed. Gaye reaches for the vocabulary of intimacy, the words you use with the people you love, and he aims them outward at strangers. That is a small and clever act of reframing. It invites us to extend to the wider human situation the same tenderness we would ordinarily keep for family. The research on empathy draws a line between merely knowing what or that another person is suffering and actually feeling them. And it's how the second tends to change how we behave. Okay, there's a difference between the intellectual and there's a difference between the emotional empathy, the felt experience. The song seems built, whether by instinct or by craft, and I honestly can't say which, to carry us across that line from information about other people's pain to the felt weight of it in our own chest. There's one more mechanism worth naming here, and it lives in the grammar. A question, unlike a statement, requires a second person. To ask is to turn towards someone. When Gay asks what's going on, the form itself pulls the listener out of passivity and into relationship, into the position of someone who is being spoken to and implicitly asked to feel with. Scholars of collective trauma, amongst them the sociologist Jeffrey Alexander and the psychologist Gillett Hirschberger, describes how wounded communities have to build shared meaning out of shared pain before they can carry it. A question asked in public is one of the oldest tools we have for beginning exactly that work. It says, "I do not understand this alone, and neither do you. So let us not understand it together." Now, you got to keep in mind that none of this happened in a vacuum. The song entered a country that was raw in very specific ways. By 1971, the United States has lived through the assassination of Martin Luther King, through summers of uprising in Watson, Detroit, and dozens of other cities, and through a war in Vietnam that was killing the young and dividing the old. For Black Americans, the contradiction had a sharp edge. Men were being asked to fight and die abroad for freedoms that they were still denied at home, and then to come back to neighborhoods policed as if they were the enemy. The soldier at the heart of this album is not an abstraction. He is the Black veteran returning to a country that wanted his service and was withheld his citizenship. And the song carries that specific injury inside its more universal one. Now, it helps to remember that that song is the opening of a larger story. The album moves from this first question out through the wreckage of the inner city, through poverty, through addiction, through a ravaged natural world. And it tells all of it in the voice of that same returning man. The single stands on its own, but it was built as an overture. The first held breath before a long exhalation of grief. Knowing that changes how the question lands. It is not idle wondering. It is the doorway into everything that follows. There is a class story here as well, and a story about power inside Motown itself. Berry Gordy had built a label on a strategy of crossover, on music polished smooth enough to move freely across the color lines and up the charts. That strategy had lifted a generation of Black artists into unprecedented reach. And it had done so partly by keeping the politics quiet. Gay's insistence on this song was a challenge to that arrangement, an argument that a Black artist at the top of the industry had the standing to speak out about suffering and not only about love. Gordy's resistance and Gay's refusal were not just a disagreement about one record. They were a negotiation about what a commercially successful Black musician was permitted to say and who got to decide. And it matters that Gay chose the register of grief rather than the register of rage. In a moment when Black anger was being widely portrayed as a threat to be managed, he answered with sorrow, with a question or with an appeal to shared feelings. That's not weakness. It was a strategic and deeply human refusal to be cast as annoying as anyone's monster. And it let the song travel into homes that would have shut the door on a clenched fist. So we come to that place where we go, well, why does it endure? So why is this song still here more than 50 years on, when 1,000 angrier and more specific protest records have faded? And part of the answer is that a question does not date the way an accusation does. Name a particular politician or a particular policy, and your song ages that moment that figure leaves the moment the figure leaves the stage. Ask what is going on, and you've built a container that every new generation could fill with its own bewilderment. The song is almost empty in a way that it actually is generous. It leaves room for the listener's grief, wherever and whatever its source is. Now, part of that refusal is to resolve, because the song never hands us the answer. It never uses itself up. We return to it not to be told what to think, but to be accompanied while we fail once again to make sense of things. That is a rarer and more durable gift than instruction. And part of it, I think, is the tenderness. The song models a way of meeting catastrophe that neither collapses into despair nor hardens it to contempt. It stays soft and it stays awake at the same time. And that combination is hard to sustain and quietly instructive. When we come back to it, we are borrowing that posture for a while. We're practicing how to look at what's really going on without turning to stone. Let me add one more observation. This one comes from the consulting room rather than the archive. People who are overwhelmed very often cannot yet say what is wrong. The feeling arrives long before any account of it does. A song that stays at the level of the question, that does not rush towards explanation, meets people exactly where distress actually lives, in that wordless stretch before understanding arrives. That is why it can hold a grieving person when a more articulate, more certain song will only bounce off them. It doesn't ask you to have worked anything out. It only asks you to ponder and wander alongside it. And for someone in pain, that permission can be its own small mercy. What's my reflection? Oh, let's share it. Let me leave you with 3 questions, and I would ask you to let them get progressively harder. First, and close to the song itself, is there a question you've asked out aloud? Not really wanting the answer, but needing to say it in company. What happened in you when you finally said it? Now, second, and a little wider, when you meet something painful in the world, which do you reach for first? The answer or the question? The verdict or the wondering? And what does your habitual reach cost you? And what does it protect you from? Third, and wider still, Marvin Gaye chose grief over rage in a moment that expected rage. Where in your own life might sorrow be the more honest and the more useful response than anger? And what would it take for you to allow it? If those questions have opened something you would like to work with more deliberate pace, this week's Patreon exercise takes the song's central move, the honest question held open, and turns it into a short and contained writing practice you can do with a notebook in about half an hour. And here's a conversation to have this week. Find one person you trust and ask them what has been troubling them lately, and then do the hard thing, which is to resist fixing it. Just stay in the room with the question a little longer than is comfortable. And notice what that does for both of you. Now, that both applies to therapists but also each and every one of us. So I'm Gunter Swoboda. This has been Songs That Made Us, which is part of Inspire Change. So until next week, stay standing.
You know, on this show, we talk a lot about living with purpose, slowing down, paying attention, and being intentional about the choices we make every day. Because when we simplify the noise around us, we can better hear what really matters. Empathy, connection, and showing up as the best version of ourselves. That's why I'm genuinely pleased to welcome our newest sponsor, Distill Union. Their philosophy aligns beautifully with what we do here. Distill Union creates slick, thoughtfully designed essentials, wallets, key organizers, phone cases, all built with a less is more approach. Their Wally wallets, Ferris key organizers, these are everyday tools that make life easier, cleaner, and calmer. In that simplicity, there's space for clarity. There's space for change. As a thank you to our Inspire Change community, they're offering 20% off any product with the promo code Inspire Change. Have a look, try them out, and see how simplifying your day can open the door to something deeper. Visit distillunion.com and enjoy 20% off any product with the promo code Inspire Change. That's distillunion.com with promo code Inspire Change to check out.
Hello to all our listeners. We thank you for tuning in and supporting positive social change, which makes you a part of Gunter's efforts in transforming not only men's lives, but lives in general. And we are grateful that you have joined us. We want to extend a huge thank you to our listeners in Jackson for bringing Mississippi to number 10 on the top 10 USA listeners list, and for the first time ever, making it to our top 20 global listeners list. We celebrate our listeners in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City for bringing Vietnam up to number 11, as well as to our listeners in Laura del Rio for bringing Spain to number 17. And lastly, a special congrats to Spain for their World Cup win. Congratulations! You've made it to the top listeners list. I, Devonna Prinzi, the co-executive producer, and our showrunner, Miranda Spigner-Sapone, sincerely thank you and ask that you please take the time to like, follow, subscribe, and share as your efforts make a difference to everyone here at Inspire Change with Gunter. If these stories resonate with you and you would like to engage more with Gunter and the Inspire Change team, please consider joining our Patreon community, where our members find bonus content and early access to video episodes. Membership awaits at patreon.com/Inspire Change. That's patreon.com/INSPIRECHANGE. As always, thank you to each and every one of our listeners. And most importantly, please keep inspiring positive social change.
Love to hear from you. And if you're interested, please check out my work on www.gunterswoboda.com or www.goodmengreat.com.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit goodmengreat.com.